If you close your eyes and imagine a medieval village in France, around the early 1500s, you might picture quiet cobblestone streets, the muffled ringing of a distant church bell, and the earthy smell of grain storage and livestock drifting on the air. Life was steady, repetitive, and filled with rituals that touched every corner of existence, from birth to burial. Yet within this predictable world, the people of Autun, a small town in Burgundy, found themselves in the middle of one of the strangest legal events in history, a trial against rats. Yes, actual rats. In our world today, the idea of summoning a colony of vermin before a judge sounds absurd, but in the late Middle Ages, this was not unusual. Across Europe, animals were often held legally responsible for the harm they caused. If a pig killed a child, the pig might be hanged. If a swarm of locusts destroyed a field, they might be excommunicated by the church. Animals, like humans, were seen as subjects under divine law. And so, when the citizens of Autun claimed that rats had eaten their grain, the matter was brought before a proper court of law. The process began, as all legal matters did, with a summons. A public crier walked through the village square, loudly announcing that the rats of the surrounding countryside were to appear in court to answer for their crimes. Imagine the scene, a man with a bell, reciting the formal language of justice, calling upon creatures who could not possibly respond. To the villagers, however, this was not comedy. It was serious business. Food was survival, and grain was wealth. If rats threatened it, then the law had to speak. Behind this ritual lay a worldview we can scarcely grasp today. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where the sacred and the mundane constantly overlapped. Church and court, scripture and daily life, were woven together. If God ruled over all creation, then even the smallest creature could, in theory, be bound by his law. Thus, to try an animal was not to engage in parody, it was to uphold cosmic order. One of the most remarkable details about the Autun trial was that the rats were given legal representation. The court appointed a man named Bartholomew Chassaigneur, a skilled lawyer who would later become famous in French legal history. His task: to defend the accused rats. Chassaigneur approached the case with complete seriousness. He did not laugh at the absurdity of his duty. Instead, he argued with legal precision, invoking rights and obligations as though his clients were present before him. When the prosecutor declared that the rats had failed to appear after being summoned, Chassaigneur objected. He pointed out that the summons had been proclaimed only once and in only a few locations. Given that the rats were scattered across fields and barns throughout the countryside, how could they reasonably be expected to hear the summons in time? Fairness demanded that the court repeat the proclamation in more places. The court, astonishingly, agreed. The summons was repeated, this time more widely. Again, the crier walked the streets, declaring that the rats of Autun must appear to stand trial. Once again, no rats arrived in court. At this point, Chassaigneur advanced an even more ingenious argument. He declared that his clients, the rats, were willing to attend but were hindered by the great number of cats lying in wait along the roads. The journey to court, he claimed, would expose them to mortal danger. Therefore, unless the court could guarantee safe passage, the rats could not reasonably be expected to appear. This argument stopped the proceedings in their tracks. The court, once again, deliberated. It had no authority to restrain all the cats of Autun, and without such a guarantee, the trial could not move forward. The rats, by their absence, and through the cleverness of their lawyer, had essentially won their case. It might seem ridiculous, but for the people of Autun, these proceedings carried weight. They reflected the values of their time: fairness, ritual, and the idea that even the lowliest creatures existed within the framework of divine justice. By treating the rats as subjects of law, the court reinforced the principle that justice extended everywhere, even into the dark corners of granaries. To modern ears, this sounds almost like theater, a strange drama played out between humans and animals. But for the medieval mind, the trial of the rats was as serious as any dispute between neighbors. The people were not mocking the law. They were showing its reach and its power to order the chaos of daily life. As you listen to this, you might picture the slow rhythms of that society: the town square, the murmur of voices, the procession of officials in robes, the solemn reading of decrees. Even in the smallest matters, life was filled with ceremony. And in this particular case, the ceremony revealed just how deeply law and faith intertwined. Yet the trial of the rats raises a quiet question, one that lingered even then. What does it mean to assign guilt to creatures that do not understand human law? Did the villagers truly believe the rats could repent, or was the trial more about reaffirming human control in a world of uncertainty? The record of the case does not say. It leaves us with a scene frozen in time, the empty benches where the rats were expected, the voice of Chasseneur echoing through the hall, and the puzzled silence of the court as the proceedings unraveled. And so, Section 1 ends with this unanswered thought. If rats could be summoned and defended like humans, where did the boundary between man and beast truly lie in the medieval imagination? When you hear that rats were summoned to court in Autun, you might be tempted to think of it as a curious local custom, a one-off oddity in the tapestry of medieval life. But the truth is stranger still. The trial of the rats was not unique. Across Europe, in town after town, animals of every kind were made to stand before the bar of justice. Pigs were the most frequent defendants. A pig that killed a child, an event not as rare as one might assume in communities where animals and humans lived in close quarters, would be arrested, imprisoned, tried, and, if found guilty, executed by hanging or burning. The execution was often carried out with the same solemnity as if the offender had been human. In some cases, pigs were even dressed in clothing before their execution, to emphasize the parallel between their guilt and that of mankind. Cows, goats, and horses also appeared in court records. If they caused harm, they too could be condemned. In one case from Switzerland in the 15th century, a cow was accused of trampling a child to death and was executed in the village square. Such actions were not intended as comedy. They were, in the medieval mind, a reinforcement of order, a way of showing that no creature stood outside the boundaries of divine and civic law. Even insects and vermin were not exempt. Locusts, weevils, caterpillars, and rats all found themselves the subjects of ecclesiastical trials. The church would issue excommunication orders against swarms that destroyed crops. Imagine the scene: priests in full vestments, candles lit, incense rising, reading out curses and banishments directed at creatures that could not understand a single word. Yet these rituals had power, not because they changed the behavior of insects, but because they reassured people that they had done what was necessary to push back against chaos. The world of the Middle Ages was fragile. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A single outbreak of disease could devastate a village. To confront these dangers, people turned not only to practical measures, storing grain, building fences, watching livestock, but also to ritual and law. To put an animal on trial was to symbolically reassert human control over forces that might otherwise seem overwhelming. The punishments varied. Execution was common for larger animals, but for smaller creatures, other measures were employed. Excommunication, exile, or banishment were pronounced. In some towns, rats or insects were formally ordered to leave the area within a certain number of days. If they failed to do so, as of course they always did, the sentence could escalate, though often nothing more could be done. The important thing was not the outcome, but the process, the declaration that justice had been sought. The figure of Bartholomew Chasseneur, the lawyer who defended the rats of Autun, stands out in this context. His arguments, which might appear tongue-in-cheek to us, were in fact a demonstration of legal craftsmanship. Chasseneur went on to become a respected jurist, writing treatises on law that influenced French legal thinking for generations. His career reminds us that even in cases that seem bizarre, the work of law was being sharpened and refined. What's more, these trials blurred the line between secular and sacred justice. Some were conducted in civil courts, others in ecclesiastical courts, and sometimes both were involved. In one case from the 15th century, a swarm of beetles in Switzerland was tried in an ecclesiastical court and ordered to leave the fields. When they did not comply, the matter was referred to civil authorities, who deliberated on how to enforce the decree. This interplay shows how deeply law and religion were intertwined. To prosecute an animal was to acknowledge that it, too, was part of creation, bound under the same divine order as man. To condemn it was to reaffirm the hierarchy: humans at the center, animals beneath, God above all. It also reveals something about the medieval sense of fairness. However strange the trials might appear, care was often taken to ensure they were conducted properly. Animals were given advocates. Proceedings were recorded with precision. Even when the outcome was inevitable, the process mattered. Justice, in their eyes, had to be done correctly, because justice was not only about practical solutions, it was about preserving cosmic balance. But why invest so much energy in these rituals? Why summon rats to court or hang pigs before a crowd? The answer lies in the psychology of the time. For medieval people, the world was alive with meaning. Every event was part of a divine tapestry. To ignore the misdeeds of animals would be to ignore the disorder they brought into that tapestry. By confronting them through law, society reaffirmed its place in the order of things. Imagine standing in a village square during one of these trials. The air is cool, the crowd hushed. A pig, bound with ropes, is brought forward. The judge sits at a wooden table, clerks with ink and parchment beside him. Witnesses testify. The child was attacked in the lane. The animal was seen with blood on its snout. The proceedings unfold with the solemnity of human justice. At the end, a sentence is pronounced. The pig is condemned. The following day, it will be executed. To us, it feels grotesque. To them, it was justice done. These animal trials also tell us something about the limits of medieval imagination. In a world without modern science, where disease and famine had mysterious causes, the law became a tool not just for regulating people, but for regulating nature itself. The courtroom became a stage where man asserted his dominion, even if only symbolically, over the creatures that threatened his survival. The trial of the rats in Autun was remarkable not because it was unique, but because it was part of a larger pattern, a pattern that reveals a society both deeply legalistic and profoundly religious, both practical and ritualistic. It was a world where fairness could be extended to vermin, where justice had to be seen to be done, even if it achieved nothing tangible. As we drift deeper into this history, one question emerges, quiet and persistent. Were these trials really about the animals, or were they, in the end, about the humans who staged them? As centuries turned, the strange spectacle of animal trials slowly faded from European life. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Enlightenment ideas were beginning to reshape the way people thought about law, reason, and the natural world. Animals were increasingly seen not as moral agents under divine law, but as creatures of instinct, governed by nature rather than conscience. The notion that a pig or a rat could be summoned to court began to feel, even to contemporaries, like a relic of a more superstitious age. And yet, these trials left behind a trail of records, reminders that once upon a time, entire communities took part in these rituals with solemn conviction. In dusty archives across France, Switzerland, and Germany, one still finds transcripts of cases against pigs, goats, and vermin, carefully written in the same precise hand used for human cases. The seriousness of the scribes tells us all we need to know. For them, this was no joke. It was law. The fading of animal trials was gradual, not sudden. In rural areas, they lingered well into the 18th century. Isolated villages clung to old ways long after cities had abandoned them. But eventually, the tide of rationalism washed over even the smallest towns. Courts began to dismiss such cases as frivolous, or refused to hear them at all. The rise of scientific explanations for disease and famine also chipped away at the need to assign blame to animals in legal terms. If a harvest failed, it was not the fault of caterpillars failing to obey a summons. It was the result of weather, soil, or crop disease. Still, the symbolism of these trials did not disappear entirely. Echoes of them remained in the way humans talked about justice. When modern courts try corporations, ships, or even governments as legal persons, they echo the same willingness to stretch the boundaries of law beyond the human body. In some ways, the trial of the rats and the pig hangings of the 15th century were not so far removed from the abstract legal reasoning that allows us today to hold an impersonal entity accountable. The question is the same. How do we enforce responsibility when direct human blame is difficult to fix? Looking back, it is tempting to laugh at the absurdity. Lawyers defending rats, priests excommunicating insects, villagers gathering solemnly to watch a goat tried for mischief. It all seems like a theater of the absurd. But if we listen closely, a different story emerges. These rituals tell us about fear, about order, about the fragile balance of survival. In a world where a bad harvest could spell death, the law reached out to tame not only men, but all of creation. There is also something strangely human about it. The people of Autun, and countless villages like it, were not fools. They knew rats would not walk into the courtroom. But by acting as though the law could encompass even the smallest creatures, they reassured themselves that the universe itself was ordered, that chaos could be contained, and that fairness mattered, even when directed at vermin. And so, the trial of the rats becomes more than a curious anecdote. It is a window into the medieval mind, a mind that saw the world as a network of obligations and hierarchies, with God above, man in the middle, and animals below. To us, The sight of an empty bench in a courtroom where rats were expected to appear is comic. To them, it was a symbol that every part of creation stood under the eye of justice. Even the career of Bartholomew Chassaigneur, the lawyer who defended the rats, carries a lesson. His success in that strange case built his reputation, eventually leading him to write influential works on French law. From the defense of vermin came arguments that would echo in more serious cases, shaping jurisprudence long after the rat trial itself was forgotten. The absurd and the serious were not separate, they were threads of the same fabric. If you think about it, the same questions linger with us today. Who, or what, can be held accountable when harm is done? Can something without a human mind be guilty? In our own age, we wrestle with such questions in different forms. Holding corporations liable for accidents, blaming governments for disasters, or even debating the responsibilities of artificial intelligence. The medieval villagers of Autun might not have understood our technology, but they would have recognized the impulse. The need to assign blame, to seek justice, to impose order on forces that seem beyond control. As you let this history settle into your mind, picture once more the courtroom in Autun. The benches are empty where the rats were supposed to sit. The judge adjusts his robe. The lawyer Chassaigneur argues for fairness, invoking the danger of cats along the road. The crowd listens in silence, some nodding at the logic, others frowning at the strangeness of it all. The record ends without resolution, leaving us with an image half serious, half absurd. The rats never came. The court never condemned them. And yet, the villagers left believing that something important had been done. Justice had been seen to stretch even into the shadows where vermin scurried. In the end, the trial of the rats reminds us of how much of history is filled not with kings and battles, but with rituals of survival, acts of reassurance, and quiet attempts to make sense of a precarious world. It is boring history, yes, slow, procedural, filled with details that seem trivial. But in those details, entire worlds of meaning open. And so the story closes with one last reflection. When humans summon animals to court, are they really judging the beasts, or are they judging themselves? Measuring their own need for order, fairness, and meaning in a universe that often feels indifferent. If you pause to look around your own room, chances are you'll find at least one window. Light streams in, soft and ordinary, so much a part of daily life that you hardly think about it. Yet there was a time in history when the simple act of letting daylight into your home came at a price, a literal tax on windows. The story of the window tax begins in 17th century Europe, where governments faced the same problem they do today: how to raise money without provoking outright rebellion. In England, in particular, the late 1600s were a period of financial strain. Wars were expensive, palaces were costly to maintain, and the machinery of state was hungry for revenue. Parliament sought ways to collect money that seemed fair, visible, and efficient. Out of these concerns emerged one of the strangest levies in history: a tax not on income or property, but on the openings in a wall. The idea was deceptively simple. The number of windows in a building was a visible measure of wealth. Poorer homes had few windows, sometimes only one or two. Wealthier households, with larger estates, boasted long rows of glass-filled openings, spilling light into spacious rooms. By taxing windows, the government created a system where, at least in theory, the rich paid more and the poor paid less. Introduced in England in 1696 under King William III, the tax quickly became known as the window tax. At first, it was modest. Homes with more than 10 windows paid extra, while those with fewer escaped the levy. But like most taxes, it grew over time. By the 18th century, the threshold had dropped, and the burden widened. What had once targeted the wealthy now reached deeply into the lives of ordinary people. The impact was immediate, and strangely visible. All across England, people began to brick up their windows. Walk through towns today, and you can still see the marks: neat rows of bricked-over arches, faintly outlined against centuries-old walls. These were not aesthetic choices. They were acts of quiet rebellion, ways to shield a household from the long reach of the tax collector. The irony was obvious even then. Windows were not a luxury in the sense of jewels or fine clothes. They were practical necessities, offering light, air, and a sense of openness in crowded towns. To block them up was to darken a home, to make it damp and unhealthy. But in the calculations of survival, avoiding the tax often outweighed comfort. The window tax was not unique to England. Variations of it appeared in France, Scotland, and other parts of Europe. Everywhere it was introduced, it left the same legacy. Buildings with fewer windows, people living in dimmer spaces, and a constant, nagging resentment toward the authorities. Critics called it a tax on light and a tax on air, arguing that it punished the very act of living. Yet governments defended it as fair. Unlike taxes on income, which were hard to measure, windows were visible and undeniable. A tax collector could simply walk down a street and count. There was little room for evasion, unless, of course, you bricked up the openings. The social consequences were striking. For the wealthy, the tax became a badge of status. To keep one's windows open and unbricked was to display not only architectural beauty but also financial power. To brick them up was to admit defeat. Thus, light itself became a marker of class. The brightness of your rooms told the world about your means. For the poor, the tax created new hardships. Small houses became darker, airless places, contributing to disease and discomfort. Some physicians of the time began to complain that the tax was harming public health by discouraging ventilation. The irony of a government measure intended to raise money for national strength while weakening the health of its citizens did not escape notice. Still, the levy persisted. Year after year, bricklayers found steady work filling in windows, while scribes recorded payments in thick ledgers. Light had become money. But as we sink deeper into this history, another question stirs in the shadows. Why did governments cling to such a tax for so long, even as its flaws became clear? Was it stubbornness, necessity, or simply the lack of better alternatives? As the window tax settled into daily life, its effects spread like a quiet shadow across towns and villages. At first, the tax may have seemed manageable, a modest payment for those with many openings, avoidable for the poor who lived in one-room cottages. But as rates increased and thresholds lowered, the burden began to touch nearly everyone. The most obvious impact was on architecture. Streetscapes changed. Houses that had once been designed with symmetry and light now bore peculiar scars. Rows of bricked-up windows that gave facades a lopsided, patched appearance. In cities like London, Bath, and Edinburgh, entire blocks of elegant townhouses displayed blank squares of brick where glass panes should have been. Builders, anticipating the tax, began designing houses with fewer windows in the first place. Future homes were shaped not by the needs of the family inside, but by the demands of the treasury. Inside these homes, life grew dimmer. Rooms that might have basked in sunlight became gloomier. Families relied more on candles, which themselves were expensive and carried risks of fire. Air circulation worsened. Damp crept into walls, and illnesses linked to poor ventilation flourished. Physicians began to speak out, arguing that the tax was literally choking the nation. One medical writer of the 19th century described the levy as a tax on health, on comfort, and on life itself. But governments persisted, because the tax was reliable. Unlike levies on income or trade, which required complex accounting, the window tax was brutally simple. A collector could stroll down a street, count the windows, and write down the amount owed. It was difficult to cheat, unless one bricked over the evidence. This gave rise to quiet acts of defiance. Across Britain and France, families hired bricklayers to seal their windows. In some towns, the sound of trowels and mortar became a familiar accompaniment to tax season. Some households even developed strategies. They would brick up just enough windows to drop into a lower tax bracket, leaving a few open for light. Others bricked over entire rows, living in semi-darkness for years. The social symbolism grew sharper. To walk past a grand house with every window intact was to see wealth flaunted. To pass by one with bricked-up gaps was to glimpse financial strain. Light itself had become a public marker of status. The brightness of your parlor revealed not just your taste but your ability to pay. In the countryside, resentment simmered. Farmers and small landowners, who already struggled with taxes on hearths, land, and tithes, now faced this additional burden. Pamphlets and petitions denounced the window tax as unjust, branding it a tax on God's light and a tax on the air of heaven. In France, the discontent over similar levies contributed to the broader sense of injustice that fueled revolutionary anger by the late 18th century. Yet not all responses were bitter. Some found ways to adapt. Architects experimented with skylights, loopholes, and hidden panels to let in light without technically creating taxable windows. In certain towns, builders developed narrow, blind windows, openings that looked like windows from the street but were filled in with plaster, giving the appearance of symmetry while avoiding taxation. Even in darkness, human ingenuity found its way. The persistence of the tax reveals something about government priorities in that era. It was not designed to encourage fairness or health, but to guarantee revenue. For over 150 years in England, successive governments clung to the levy, adjusting rates but refusing to abandon it. They chose the certainty of income over the complaints of physicians and householders alike. And so daily life adapted. Families dined by candlelight even at midday. Children squinted over their lessons in dim corners. Streets grew darker, with entire facades turned blind to the sun. Light, once freely welcomed, had been transformed into a commodity controlled by the state. It leaves us with a curious question. How much did people truly suffer from the tax, and how much was symbolic outrage at the principle of paying for light? Was it the gloom that weighed on them most, or the sense that something so natural had been taken and monetized? By the 19th century, the window tax had become one of the most despised levies in Britain. What had once seemed like a clever, simple solution for raising funds now stood as a glaring symbol of governmental stubbornness and social injustice. The sight of bricked-up windows was no longer just a matter of architectural quirk. It was a daily reminder of how deeply the state could intrude into the private lives of its citizens. Physicians had long argued against it. Reports circulated that the lack of fresh air and light inside homes was worsening outbreaks of tuberculosis and other diseases. Writers and reformers joined the chorus, branding the levy as a tax on health and a tax on life. The argument was powerful. By taxing light and air, the government was quite literally taxing survival itself. Public discontent grew louder. In pamphlets, newspapers, and speeches, reformers denounced the absurdity of charging people for windows. Cartoonists mocked the idea with satirical drawings of tax collectors peering into homes to count panes of glass. The levy had become a symbol of all that was wrong with taxation: intrusive, arbitrary, and harmful. Meanwhile, architecture continued to bear the scars. Entire Georgian terraces displayed neat rows of false windows, plastered over to preserve symmetry while keeping costs down. Even in wealthier homes, families weighed the cost of comfort against the burden of taxation. To live in light was to pay dearly, to live in gloom was to save. The choice haunted households for generations. In France, where similar taxes had been imposed, resentment had already helped fuel revolutionary sentiment. By the time of the French Revolution, the impotence de portes et fenêtres, the tax on doors and windows, was widely hated. It was seen as a levy that punished the poor disproportionately, as small houses with fewer rooms but many windows often bore heavier burdens than sprawling estates. Light, once again, had become a political issue. Back in Britain, pressure mounted through the early 1800s. Reform movements gained momentum, connecting the window tax to larger calls for fairness in government. The Industrial Revolution added to the urgency. Cities grew crowded and unhealthy, and the need for ventilation and light in working-class housing became undeniable. Physicians, reformers, and ordinary citizens now stood united. The tax had to go. Finally, in 1851, after more than 150 years, the British government abolished the window tax. In its place, they introduced a property tax based on rental value, a system less visible but also less absurd. The repeal was greeted with relief and celebration. Bricked-up windows were reopened, sunlight poured back into darkened rooms, and the scars of taxation slowly began to fade from city facades. Yet the legacy of the tax lingers. Walk through historic towns in England, Scotland, or France, and you will still see them. Blind windows, bricked squares where glass once was, mute witnesses to centuries of policy. Architects still talk about the window tax effect, using it as a shorthand for how governments shape design in unintended ways. Even today, debates about housing, ventilation, and access to light echo the old complaints of unfairness. It is striking to realize that something as ordinary as a pane of glass could become the center of political struggle. But in that struggle lies a deeper truth. Governments, in their search for revenue, often touch the most intimate corners of life. When they taxed windows, they taxed not wealth in the abstract, but the very experience of being alive in a space filled with air and sun. Looking back, we might laugh at the absurdity of it. A tax collector walking down the street, counting windows, ledger in hand. But for those who lived in darkened rooms, it was no joke. It was a daily reminder that even light could be monetized. And so, the story of the window tax closes with this reflection. When light and air can be taxed, What remains untouchable? What, if anything, lies beyond the reach of governments hungry for revenue? In our modern world, turning on a tap is so ordinary that you hardly pause to consider it. A twist of the wrist, and clean water flows instantly, cold, pure, and endless. But if you lived in a medieval city, water was not at your fingertips. It was heavy, it was precious, and it was almost always carried to you by someone else. The water carriers of medieval Europe were among the most essential, and yet least remembered, figures of urban life. They were the men and women who trudged daily through the narrow, filthy streets of Paris, London, or Florence, bent beneath the weight of wooden buckets or leather sacks. With steady, plodding steps, they delivered the liquid that made bread rise, that filled cooking pots, that slaked thirst, and that cleansed, in the most basic way, the human body. Cities of the Middle Ages were dense, crowded, and often built without planning. Wells were scarce, aqueducts were crumbling remnants of Roman engineering, and rivers were polluted with waste. To fetch water was no small task. If you lived near a fountain or a public well, you might draw it yourself, waiting in line with neighbors. But for many households, especially the wealthier ones, water was brought by hired carriers. The life of a water carrier was grueling. Buckets were heavy. A single wooden vessel might hold 20 or 30 pounds when full. Carriers often bore two at a time, suspended from a yoke balanced across the shoulders, or hauled leather bags strapped to their backs. Streets were uneven, sometimes little more than muddy lanes, slick with refuse. A stumble could spill precious gallons, wasted effort soaking into the dirt. Yet the work was constant. From dawn until dusk, carriers moved in slow circuits, supplying households, taverns, bakeries, and breweries. Their trade was vital to city survival. Without them, bread could not be baked, beer could not be brewed, and families could not drink or wash. The job carried its own risks. Water was heavy enough to strain the body over years, bending spines, wearing down joints, and exhausting muscles. Exposure to the elements was constant: rain, snow, and summer heat. And then there was the danger of disease. Carriers worked with water from sources that were not always clean. Rivers teemed with waste, wells were sometimes fouled, and even public fountains could be suspect. To carry water was to carry, unknowingly, the seeds of plague and fever. Still, the carriers were indispensable. In Paris, guilds of water carriers formed as early as the 14th century, regulating their trade and defending their rights. They wore distinctive clothing, so households would recognize them as they passed through the streets. In London, the cobs, as they were called, carried water from the Thames and sold it by the bucket. Their cries echoed through the lanes, announcing their service to anyone in need. The social status of a water carrier was low, but their presence was constant. They were part of the hum of city life, as familiar as the toll of bells or the clatter of carts. For a coin, they delivered what no city dweller could live without. In taverns and markets, people might grumble about the price of bread or ale, but few forgot that behind those goods stood the bent backs of water carriers. We sometimes imagine medieval cities as static, timeless places, but the daily labor of carriers reveals their constant motion. Buckets swung, feet trudged, water sloshed, and life flowed with them. Without their work, the city itself would have ground to a halt. And so, in the quiet rhythm of their steps, another question arises. What did it mean to live in a world where even the simplest necessity, a drink of water, depended on the backbreaking labor of another? By the high Middle Ages, water in the city was not just a necessity, it was a business. Carriers turned the endless demand for fresh water into a trade that touched every corner of urban life. To understand their world is to step into the quiet economy of thirst that sustained medieval towns. In most European cities, water was drawn from a limited number of sources: rivers, public wells, and, in some fortunate places, aqueduct-fed fountains. But not every household could afford the time or the labor to fetch it. Wealthier families, guild masters, and inns relied on hired water carriers who delivered it in steady circuits. A coin bought not only water but also relief from the exhausting walk through crowded lanes to the nearest fountain. The trade itself was regulated in many places. In Paris, carriers were organized into guilds by the 14th century. Membership offered a degree of protection, but also imposed obligations. Carriers had to respect certain prices, follow agreed-upon routes, and sometimes wear marks of their profession. Their buckets and yokes were distinctive, their cries familiar, and their presence constant. London had its own version, the cobs, or water bearers. They carried water from the Thames or from conduits installed by wealthy benefactors. In some neighborhoods, public conduits were locked at night, and only licensed carriers had the right to draw from them. This gave the carriers a kind of quiet authority, as well as steady income. But income was rarely enough to lift them into comfort. Water carrying was among the hardest and lowest paid trades. The work strained the body, and the competition was fierce. Young men, strong enough to haul bucket after bucket, often dominated the trade, but many grew worn and broken before reaching middle age. It was, quite literally, a job that bent people out of shape. And yet, despite their low status, carriers were indispensable to the city's functioning. Consider the baker. Bread was the staple food of Europe, and every loaf required water. Without carriers to supply the bakeries, ovens would fall silent. The same was true for brewers, who relied on great quantities of water to produce ale and beer, the everyday drink of townsfolk, often safer than raw water itself. In this way, the carriers stood invisibly at the foundation of the urban food chain. The trade also shaped city rhythms. Carriers often worked on credit, delivering water daily and collecting payments weekly. Their rounds created a web of trust and obligation that bound neighborhoods together. A carrier who failed in his duty could quickly earn a bad reputation, while one who was reliable might be known and welcomed across entire districts. The presence of carriers also reflected the inequalities of city life. The poor, unable to hire them, fetched their own water, waiting in long lines at wells and fountains. The wealthy, meanwhile, paid to have it delivered, sparing themselves the inconvenience. Light and air might have been taxed by governments, but water was taxed by labor, a reminder that survival itself was stratified by class. Carriers sometimes became minor figures in city politics. In times of crisis, drought, plague, or siege, their trade took on new urgency. Control of water sources could mean power, and carriers were occasionally caught up in disputes between guilds, parishes, or even between citizens and the crown. In Paris, records survive of disputes between water carriers and other trades over access to fountains. To us, the quarrels seem small, but to them, they touched the heart of survival. Over time, the carriers' work began to decline, replaced slowly by more permanent systems. In London, by the 17th century, water companies laid wooden pipes to distribute water directly into some homes. In Paris, new aqueducts and fountains reduced reliance on human backs. But for centuries before, it was the carriers' steady steps that kept life flowing. As we imagine them, bent beneath the weight, shoes sinking into mud, voices calling through narrow streets, one wonders, how many lives passed unnoticed because they were spent in the endless task of carrying what everyone needed, yet no one wished to think about? By the dawn of the modern era, the steady footsteps of water carriers began to fade from Europe's streets. For centuries, they had been as common as the toll of bells or the chatter of market stalls. Yet progress, slow, uneven, but relentless, gradually made their work obsolete. The first challenge to their trade came with engineering. In some cities, wealthy patrons or civic leaders funded the construction of aqueducts, cisterns, and fountains. Renaissance Florence, for instance, restored ancient Roman systems to bring water into its heart. Paris, under Henri IV and later Louis XIV, invested heavily in aqueducts and elaborate fountains. London, in the early 17th century, saw private companies begin laying pipes, hollowed-out wooden logs at first, to channel water directly into paying households. These innovations were patchy, serving mainly the wealthy or central districts. But each new pipe and each new fountain chipped away at the carrier's role. For the first time, water was beginning to flow without the need for bent backs and sloshing buckets. The carriers did not vanish overnight. In poorer quarters, in villages, and in towns where no aqueduct or pipe reached, their trade lingered. In Paris, guilds of water carriers still operated into the 18th century. In London, cobs still hauled Thames water well into the 1600s. In some parts of Eastern Europe, the tradition endured into the 19th century. But gradually, their presence shrank, until they were no longer the lifeblood of the city, but rather shadows of an older way of living. Their disappearance was hardly noticed. There were no monuments erected, no songs sung, no elegies written for the carriers. They left behind no chronicles of their own, no memoirs or grand records. Instead, they exist now only in the margins, mentions in guild rolls, scribbled contracts in city ledgers, occasional notes in diaries about the man who brought water to the door. They were, in the truest sense, invisible laborers. And yet, their absence reshaped urban life. As water began to flow through pipes, new patterns emerged. Homes grew brighter, fresher, and healthier. Disease from stagnant water declined. The labor once expended on carrying water could be directed elsewhere, fueling new trades, new crafts, and new industries. Progress, as always, came with gains and losses. What was lost, though, was a certain intimacy. Carriers were part of the social fabric of medieval towns. They knew their neighborhoods, their customers, their routes. They were trusted with access to homes, relied upon in times of drought or illness. When they vanished, a quiet human link in the chain of survival disappeared. In their place came something colder, more mechanical, the hiss of water through pipes, the turn of a tap, the anonymity of utility. We often think of history in terms of kings, wars, and revolutions. But the story of the water carriers reminds us that civilization depends just as much on forgotten shoulders. Without them, bread could not be baked, beer could not be brewed, and families could not have lived day to day. They were the silent infrastructure of their age. Even now, if you walk the older quarters of cities like Paris or London, you may find narrow alleys where carriers once trudged, their buckets sloshing against their legs. The stones beneath your feet once bore their weight. And though their names are mostly lost, their work sustained millions of lives. The story of the water carriers closes, then, with a reflection that extends beyond their time. How many of the great structures of history rest, unseen, on the bent backs of forgotten laborers, people who carried the burdens of survival while leaving little trace of themselves. Facial hair, for most of history, has been more than just a matter of fashion. It has been a marker of identity, masculinity, holiness, and sometimes even rebellion. And yet, there was a time when the matter of a man's beard became not just a personal choice but the subject of papal decree, a literal ban, handed down from the throne of St. Peter itself. To understand why popes once turned their gaze toward whiskers, we must step back into the long centuries of medieval Christendom, when the appearance of a priest or a monk was not simply a matter of personal grooming but a public statement of order, humility, and discipline. In the early church, clerics often wore beards. Many of the church fathers, from Augustine to Jerome, are depicted with them in manuscripts and mosaics. In the East, particularly among the Orthodox clergy, the tradition of long, flowing beards endured. The beard was associated with wisdom, dignity, and the biblical patriarchs. But in the West, things shifted. By the time of Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, a different standard was emerging. The Latin Church emphasized clerical celibacy and spiritual discipline. Smooth, shaven faces were seen as outward signs of inward purity. A beard, with its unruly natural growth, was increasingly interpreted as a mark of worldliness, pride, or even vanity. And so, in the 12th century, the papacy issued one of its stranger directives. Priests were to shave their beards. Councils reiterated the rule, and canon law absorbed it. 4 centuries afterward, a clean-shaven face became the official expectation for Latin Rite clergy. The beard, once a symbol of holy wisdom, had been redefined as an obstacle to sanctity. The enforcement of this rule was not just about grooming. It was part of a broader effort to distinguish clergy from laity, to mark them visibly as set apart. A shaved face became a uniform of sorts, as recognizable as the tonsure that removed a ring of hair from the crown. To grow a beard in defiance was not simply a fashion choice, it was a quiet form of resistance. The ban also reflected tensions between East and West. In the Orthodox world, beards remained a sacred tradition. Icons of saints and patriarchs displayed thick, flowing facial hair, linking them to the prophets of old. In the Catholic West, by contrast, the ideal became the smooth-faced priest. The beard, in this sense, was caught up in the great division of Christendom itself, a symbol of identity in the long shadow of the schism. But what did this mean in daily life? For parishioners, it meant that their priests, whether in small villages or great cathedrals, were instantly recognizable by their clean-shaven chins. For clergy, it meant constant attention to grooming, a razor scraping in the dim light, soap and water in a basin, the quiet ritual of keeping the face smooth. And for the church, it meant asserting authority over even the smallest details of the body. To legislate beards was to declare that nothing was beyond the scope of discipline, not even the hairs on a man's chin. Yet beneath the surface, questions lingered. Was shaving truly a mark of holiness, or was it an arbitrary rule imposed by human authority? Could a beard really signify sin? Or was this one of many ways the Church sought to shape identity through visible, external signs? Once the papacy had spoken on the matter, the expectation of a clean-shaven clergy rippled outward across Western Europe. What had begun as a matter of papal discipline soon became woven into the very fabric of parish life. A priest without a beard was no longer unusual. He was the norm, the embodiment of what it meant to be set apart from the laity. The theological reasoning was subtle, almost hidden beneath layers of custom. The beard was often described in canon law as a sign of vanity, something that distracted from the spiritual life. A smooth face, by contrast, symbolized purity and humility. Monastic writers added their own interpretations. To shave the beard was to shave away pride, to strip the self of worldly adornment, and to keep the face open, childlike, before God. For parishioners, these ideas mattered less than the simple visual distinction. You could walk into a crowded marketplace and know instantly who was a priest and who was not. Tonsured crown and smooth chin, these became, together, the uniform of the Latin clergy. Even in the smallest villages, where priests lived among their flock, shared their bread, and joined in the daily rhythms of life, their appearance kept them set apart. But not everyone accepted the decree quietly. Some priests, especially in border regions where Catholic and Orthodox traditions overlapped, resisted. In parts of Italy and along the fringes of Eastern Europe, beards were worn defiantly, a visible sign of allegiance to older customs. These tensions sometimes flared into disputes, with bishops reprimanding clergy who refused to shave. Among the laity, too, the rule had curious consequences. The beard ban for priests did not extend to ordinary men, of course, but it shaped perceptions of beards more broadly. In societies where the Church defined morality, the image of the clean-shaven priest gradually influenced secular ideals of respectability. To appear before authority with a smooth face suggested seriousness and discipline. Beards, meanwhile, slipped into associations with disorder, eccentricity, or even dissent. This did not mean beards vanished from Europe. Far from it. Knights, nobles, and peasants alike continued to wear them, often proudly. But the cultural meaning of facial hair shifted. A beard was no longer simply a natural growth. It was, in the Catholic West, something that marked you as emphatically not clerical. At times, rulers themselves entered the debate. In France, certain monarchs preferred their courtiers clean-shaven, echoing clerical ideals. In England, by contrast, later kings like Henry VIII flaunted beards as symbols of power, creating a cultural tug-of-war between royal fashion and papal precedent. The face, it turned out, was a contested frontier, where religion, politics, and personal identity collided. Within the Church itself, the ban created small rebellions. Some priests quietly allowed their beards to grow between shaves, arguing that constant removal was impractical. Others protested in writing, questioning the theological basis of the rule. A few saints were even depicted with beards in Western iconography, creating curious contradictions between law and devotion. Yet, despite these frictions, the beard ban endured for centuries. It became one of those invisible rules that shaped daily life without always drawing notice. Priests shaved because priests had always shaved. Parishioners expected it because their fathers and grandfathers had expected it. The papal decree had hardened into tradition, unquestioned by most, and woven seamlessly into the fabric of Catholic identity. And yet, beneath the calm surface, questions lingered like faint stubble. Could holiness really be read in the absence of hair? Or was this simply one more way in which authority marked the body, inscribing obedience on the face itself? For centuries, the Latin Church clung to its beard ban with the quiet persistence of tradition. Priests shaved, bishops shaved, monks shaved. The smooth chin became as much a part of clerical identity as the tonsure on the crown or the vestments at Massachusetts. Yet, like all rules, it eventually softened under the weight of time, cultural shifts, and simple practicality. By the Renaissance, winds of change were stirring. Across Europe, styles shifted. Kings and nobles, painters and philosophers all experimented with facial hair. Portraits from the 15th and 16th centuries reveal a renewed fashion for beards and mustaches among the elite. In some ways, the return of the beard was a statement, a sign of virility, power, and learned dignity. The contrast with clean-shaven clergy became sharper, and questions began to stir once more. The Reformation added fuel to the fire. Protestant reformers, eager to distinguish themselves from Catholic traditions, often embraced the beard. Martin Luther is famously depicted with a thick, pointed beard, and other reformers followed suit. The beard, in this context, became not only a fashion statement but also a theological one, a symbol of breaking from papal control. In response, Catholic priests continued to shave, their bare chins reinforcing the visual line between themselves and their Protestant rivals. Yet the divide was never absolute. Some Catholic clergy quietly let their beards grow, particularly in frontier regions or among certain monastic orders. In missionary territories, where shaving was impractical or culturally inappropriate, priests sometimes adapted to local norms. Slowly, exceptions chipped away at the rigidity of the ban. By the 18th century, enforcement had slackened. Canon law still carried traces of the prohibition, but bishops rarely punished infractions. In some regions, priests appeared with modest beards or trimmed mustaches, and parishioners barely raised an eyebrow. The once rigid decree had become more of a suggestion. The 19th century brought further change. Romantic ideals of masculinity revived the beard in Europe and beyond. Soldiers, poets, and national heroes wore facial hair with pride. It was only a matter of time before the clergy followed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Catholic priests with mustaches or small beards were no longer shocking. The old papal ban had withered into obscurity. Today, in the Catholic Church, there is no universal rule against beards. Many priests remain clean-shaven, following long custom, but others wear trimmed facial hair without controversy. In the Orthodox East, of course, the tradition of full beards never wavered. The once sharp contrast has softened, leaving only history to remind us that, for centuries, the face itself was a battlefield of authority. The legacy of the beard ban is curious. On the surface, it was about grooming. Beneath, it was about power, identity, and the visible signs of obedience. The clean-shaven chin was a daily ritual of submission, a constant reminder that even the smallest details of life fell under the scope of the Church. It showed the reach of authority, not just into politics or theology, but into the hairs of the face itself. Looking back, the story raises a quiet question that lingers still. How much of what we call tradition is born not of necessity or holiness, but of rules once imposed, obeyed for generations, and then forgotten, leaving only the faint outline of authority on the human body? If you live in a land of butter, it is easy to take it for granted, the pale block softening on the kitchen table, the golden smear melting across bread. But in medieval Europe, butter was not simply a matter of taste or diet. It was caught up in questions of faith, discipline, and authority. For centuries, butter was at the heart of a quiet struggle between ordinary people and the churchmen who sought to regulate what they ate. The origins of this war lie in the Church's rules on fasting. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians in Western Europe were bound by strict dietary restrictions, especially during Lent, Advent, and on numerous fast days scattered through the year. Meat was forbidden, as were animal products like milk, eggs, and butter. Fish was usually permitted, which meant coastal regions fared better than inland communities. For wealthy monasteries and aristocrats, abstaining from butter may have been an inconvenience. But for peasants in Northern Europe, where olive oil was scarce and expensive, butter was not just a luxury, it was a necessity. It was the fat that flavored porridge, greased pans, and kept bread from being dry. To be told that for weeks at a time one could not eat, it was not a minor inconvenience but a genuine hardship. This tension produced what might be called the butter wars. People wanted butter, the Church said no. But as always, human ingenuity found ways to bend the rules. One of the most famous compromises emerged in France and Germany, where the faithful could pay for indulgences, essentially buying permission to eat butter during Lent. Cathedrals and churches even built special funds from these payments. The great spire of Rouen Cathedral in France, for example, was partly financed by what was known as the beurre money, donations made in exchange for dispensations to consume butter. In some regions, entire dioceses negotiated exceptions. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, bishops granted permission for butter consumption during fasts, acknowledging that the absence of olive oil made strict enforcement unrealistic. These permissions often came with payments attached, turning the Church's prohibition into a quiet source of revenue. The resentment, however, never fully disappeared. For peasants, it felt like a double injustice. Not only were they deprived of their staple fat, but the wealthy could easily buy indulgences while the poor endured the rules. Butter became a symbol of inequality, of the way faith and finance intertwined in the medieval world. And yet, despite the resentment, the rituals of abstinence persisted. Kitchens across Europe fell silent in the weeks before Easter, pans scrubbed clean of dairy, families turning reluctantly to fish or thin vegetable stews. Butter, when it returned to the table, tasted all the sweeter for its absence. It is easy to laugh at such disputes today. A quarrel over butter seems trivial compared to wars, plagues, or revolutions. But to the people of the Middle Ages, it was serious. It touched their survival, their dignity, and their faith. It forced them to navigate the narrow line between obedience and necessity, between spiritual discipline and physical hunger. And so, the butter wars were not really about butter at all. They were about who had the power to decide what could be eaten, and when. They were about how deeply authority could reach into the household pot. They were about the tension between the universal rules of the church and the particular needs of local communities. As we step deeper into this story, one question lingers. How did butter, of all things, come to stand at the crossroads of faith, survival, and power in medieval Europe? Once the church drew its line against butter, the people of Europe responded in ways that reveal the constant negotiation between authority and necessity. The butter wars were not fought with swords, but with coins, petitions, and the stubborn persistence of daily hunger. In northern Europe, butter was not an indulgence but a cornerstone of diet. Olive oil, the preferred substitute during fasts, was imported at great cost, often rancid by the time it reached inland towns. For a Parisian noble, perhaps oil could be bought. For a Saxon peasant or a Flemish farmer, butter was the only fat available. When the church declared it forbidden during fasts, the rule felt less like a spiritual discipline and more like a punishment. So communities rebelled, not always with open defiance, but through negotiation. Bishops, recognizing the futility of demanding abstinence, often granted dispensations. These were not free. Payments flowed into diocesan coffers in exchange for official permission to eat butter. What began as an act of piety became, in practice, a revenue stream. The most famous example was Rouen Cathedral in Normandy. Its soaring Gothic spire, one of the marvels of medieval architecture, was partly funded by the so-called butter tower, built with money collected from indulgences that allowed people to consume dairy during Lent. Parishioners joked, half bitterly, that their butter was literally being turned into stone. The tower still stands today, a monument not just to faith, but to the practical compromises between spiritual law and human appetite. In Germany, similar practices developed. In regions where butter was essential, bishops quietly relaxed restrictions, especially for the poor. In some places, entire dioceses were granted permission to use butter in Lent, provided certain payments were made. The system blurred the line between spiritual discipline and economic transaction, and critics of the church seized on it as evidence of corruption. Monasteries, too, played a role. Benedictine and Cistercian monks followed strict rules of fasting, but as landowners and producers of butter, they faced a paradox. Their barns filled with dairy products, but their tables were forbidden to enjoy them. Over time, dispensations crept in, and some monasteries found ways to use butter in cooking without openly defying the rules. The irony was clear. Those who produced the most butter often had to bend the most rules to consume it. The disputes also shaped local cuisines. In regions where indulgences were common, butter became a staple even in fasting dishes, folded discreetly into pastries or used to grease pans for fish. In Mediterranean lands, where olive oil was abundant, butter was less significant, and the bans carried little weight. The cultural divide grew sharper. North of the Alps, butter became a symbol of identity, tied to the rhythms of rural life. South of the Alps, olive oil remained king, and butter was a rarity. Resentment simmered, particularly among the poor. They saw clearly that the wealthy could buy their way around the rules while peasants bore the full burden. To abstain from butter was to eat poorly. To purchase indulgences was to enjoy comfort. Butter thus became a symbol of inequality, a reminder that even the kitchen table reflected the divisions of medieval society. And yet, the system endured. Families adapted. They scraped by during fasts with thin stews, waiting for Easter when butter returned with joy. Children grew up with the rhythm of denial and reward, tasting the richness of dairy as part of the cycle of the liturgical year. But as centuries passed, and criticisms of the church grew louder, the butter wars became more than a local grievance. Reformers began to use them as ammunition, asking why salvation and sustenance could be bought with coins. Butter, once confined to kitchens and pans, became part of a wider debate about authority, corruption, and reform. And so, beneath the surface of melted fat and kitchen fires, another question began to rise. Was this truly about fasting, or was it about power, the church's power to reach into every household pot and dictate what could and could not be eaten? By the late Middle Ages, the butter question was no longer just about what people ate during Lent. It had become a symbol of the uneasy relationship between ordinary believers and the authority of the church. For peasants in the north, butter bans felt like laws written by men who lived far away, eating olive oil and fish, while the poor trudged through snow and mud with little but dairy to sustain them. The practice of buying dispensations persisted, but it left a sour taste. To some, it looked like a quiet compromise between faith and necessity. To others, it looked like corruption dressed up in piety. Why should God's mercy come at the price of a coin? Why should comfort at the dinner table be available only to those who could pay? As the 16th century dawned, voices of reform began to seize on such contradictions. Martin Luther, railing against indulgences, spoke broadly about the abuses of the church, and though butter was hardly his main concern, the practice of selling permission to eat it during fasts was part of the same culture of transaction he opposed. Protestants in Northern Europe pointed to the butter bans as evidence of Rome's blindness to local needs, its insistence on uniform rules in a world of diverse climates and diets. Slowly, the bans loosened. In many regions, bishops stopped enforcing them strictly. In others, communities simply ignored them, confident that their necessity outweighed the threat of censure. By the 18th century, the butter wars had largely ended, not with a dramatic decree, but with a slow erosion of practice. Fasts continued, but butter found its way quietly into kitchens, no longer policed with vigor. The legacy of these disputes lingered in unexpected ways. In Normandy, where indulgence payments had once funded the soaring butter tower of Rouen Cathedral, butter became a point of pride, woven deeply into local cuisine. In Germany and the Low Countries, butter-based pastries became cultural staples, their roots tracing back to centuries of negotiation between appetite and authority. Even in England, where butter was less central, its association with hearty northern diets endured. The story also left behind a political lesson. The butter bans had shown ordinary people just how far the church would reach into their daily lives. They revealed how spiritual discipline could be turned into financial transaction, how necessity could become leverage. For centuries, the issue had simmered quietly. In the age of reform, it became one more spark in a broader fire. Today, the idea of a butter war might sound quaint, even comic. But to the people who lived through it, the matter was deadly serious. Butter was not luxury, it was survival. To lose it for weeks at a time was to live with hunger and resentment. To buy it back with coins was to feel the weight of inequality. To protest its ban was, in its small way, to protest the power of institutions that seemed remote and unyielding. And so, the great butter wars of Europe remind us that history is often shaped not only in parliaments and battlefields, but in kitchens and hearths. The quiet disputes over food, the negotiations over daily survival, reveal as much about a society as its great events. The story ends with a reflection as rich as the butter itself. When something as ordinary as food becomes a matter of power, does it ever remain ordinary again? Or does every meal, every morsel, become a quiet echo of the struggles that shaped it? In the quiet of a medieval village, the toll of a church bell marked time itself. It summoned the faithful to prayer, announced births and deaths, and gave order to the day. Yet bells were not only instruments of time and ritual. For centuries, people believed they could reach beyond the village square, beyond even the human ear, into the very heavens themselves. In times of storm, when black clouds gathered and thunder rolled across the hills, the bells were rung not to mark the hour, but to drive back the storm. The belief was rooted in the medieval worldview, where natural and spiritual forces overlapped. To us, thunder is electricity, lightning a discharge of energy in the sky. To them, these were signs of divine power, or sometimes of demonic mischief. Storms were terrifying events. They destroyed crops, toppled houses, set fires, and threatened the fragile balance of survival. The ringing of bells was thought to break the storm's force, to scatter clouds, and to silence thunder. The practice was widespread across Europe by the 13th century. In France, it was so common that many church bells were cast with inscriptions like Fugo Tenitrua, I drive away thunder. In Germany, similar phrases appeared, promising protection against lightning and hail. The belief was not mere superstition to them. It was ritual, a way of pushing back against the chaos of the natural world. The act itself was dramatic. As dark skies gathered, a bell ringer would climb the wooden steps of the tower, seize the rope, and set the great bronze tongue swinging. The deep clang rolled out across the fields, mingling with the rumble of thunder. Villagers, hearing it, would pause in their work, crossing themselves, whispering prayers. The sound was not just noise, it was a shield. Each toll was thought to shatter the storm's power, each vibration a weapon against unseen forces. Behind the belief was an old idea. That sound itself could alter the world. Bells were considered sacred instruments, consecrated with holy water and blessed by priests. They were sometimes called the voice of God in the village, their tones thought to repel evil spirits and demons. If demons lurked in the storm clouds, then the bells would drive them away. The logic was reinforced by coincidence. Storms do not last forever. Sometimes, after the bells were rung, the clouds did break, the rain did stop. To villagers, this was proof of the bell's power. In the fragile balance of medieval life, where survival depended on faith as much as on toil, such confirmation was enough. But the practice was not without its risks. Lightning struck towers often. Tall structures with metal bells, ringing during storms, made tempting targets for bolts from the sky. Chronicles record tragic tales of bell ringers killed in their duty, struck down as they clung to the ropes. Some churches were set ablaze this way, their wooden steeples consumed by fire. Yet the belief endured. To ring the bells was an act of courage, of faith, and of service to the whole community. The ringing against storms became so common that it entered law and custom. In some towns, it was the official duty of the bell ringer to climb the tower at the first sign of thunder. Failure to do so might be met with scolding or fines, for the safety of the harvest was at stake. To us, the image may seem quaint, a lone figure pulling a rope while lightning forks across the sky. But for those villagers, the act was no less real than sowing grain or patching a roof. It was one more tool in their constant struggle against a world that could destroy them with wind, water, and fire. And so, we are left with a question that hangs in the storm-laden air. Did the bells truly fight the storm, or did they simply give the people courage to endure it? The ringing of bells during storms was never a casual act. It followed patterns, rituals, and deeply held beliefs that tied sound to survival. In the medieval imagination, a bell was not just a tool of metal and rope. It was a sacred object, consecrated with prayer, blessed with holy oils, and sometimes given a name as though it were a living guardian of the village. When a storm rose over the horizon, the ritual began. The bell ringer, often a young man chosen for his strength and agility, hurried up the narrow, twisting stairs of the church tower. At the top, amid the timbers and swaying ropes, he took hold of the line. Below, villagers paused their work, glancing anxiously at the sky. Then came the first strike, a deep, resonant toll that carried across the fields. It was not just noise. Each toll was believed to shatter thunder, to break the air, scattering the forces of the storm. In some places, specific prayers were spoken aloud as the bells rang, invoking saints known for protection against lightning, Saint Barbara, Saint Donatus, or Saint Florian. The ritual combined sound and supplication, earthly effort and heavenly aid. In France and Germany, inscriptions on bells themselves reinforced the belief. Words like Vivo es voco, Mortuos plango, Fulgura frango, I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning, were cast into the bronze. The bell was both instrument and prayer, its voice carrying divine power into the clouds. But the ritual was dangerous. Towers were often the tallest structures in a village, and their bells the largest pieces of metal. To swing them in the middle of a storm was, though unknown to the medieval mind, an invitation for lightning. Chronicles record many tragedies. Bell towers struck and shattered, wooden steeples set ablaze, ringers killed instantly by bolts from the heavens. One account from the 15th century tells of a bell ringer in Germany found dead, still clutching the rope, after lightning split the tower above him. In France, whole groups of ringers were sometimes killed when lightning struck the bell frame, the current racing down the wet ropes into their hands. And yet, despite these grim fates, the practice endured. The belief in the bell's power outweighed the risks of its ringing. Communities formalized the duty. In some towns, bell ringers were paid extra for storm duty, a kind of hazard wage. In others, the role fell to younger apprentices, thought strong enough to endure the task. Local laws even mandated ringing. If thunder sounded and the bells were silent, questions would be asked of the ringer, and sometimes of the priest. The storm demanded action, and the bell was the weapon at hand. The church largely supported the practice. Bells were blessed in elaborate ceremonies, sprinkled with holy water, anointed with chrism, and named as though baptized. Priests assured the faithful of their protective powers. The idea was not out of step with medieval theology. If sound could drive demons from a haunted house, why not from storm clouds? If bells could call souls to worship, why not scatter the forces of nature that threatened survival? To the villagers, the results were proof enough. Storms eventually broke, as storms always do. If the bells rang and the skies cleared, it was victory. If lightning struck despite the tolling, it was interpreted not as failure but as mystery, God's will, perhaps, or insufficient fervor in the prayers. The belief was resilient, flexible enough to survive contradiction. But as centuries passed, skepticism grew. The Renaissance brought a new spirit of inquiry, and early scientists began to question the practice. By the 17th century, voices were raised against storm ringing, noting not only its ineffectiveness but its danger. When Benjamin Franklin demonstrated the electrical nature of lightning in the 18th century, the peril of standing in a bell tower during a storm became undeniable. Still, in many villages, the ritual persisted. Habit and fear are powerful forces. Even when warned of danger, many ringers continued their climbs, ropes in hand, convinced they were defending their neighbors from destruction. Some clung to the belief into the 19th century, long after science had explained why towers burned and men died. The story of storm bells is thus one of ritual meeting reality, of faith persisting against evidence. To ring against thunder was not only to fight the storm but to assert control in a world where control was scarce. And so the question tolls in our ears like an echo. Were the bells rung for the sky, or were they rung for the people, to give courage, to create order, and to make fear bearable? By the 18th century, the age-old practice of ringing bells against storms began to face its greatest challenge, not from thunder itself, but from science. The idea that sound could shatter storms, that bronze bells could break lightning, was slowly undermined by a new understanding of the natural world. The turning point came with discoveries about electricity. Experiments in the mid-18th century, most famously those of Benjamin Franklin, revealed that lightning was not the weapon of demons but a natural discharge of electrical force. A storm was not something to be frightened away with noise, but something to be grounded, tamed with metal rods that drew its power harmlessly into the earth. At first, these ideas met resistance. In rural Europe, centuries of practice do not vanish overnight. Villagers trusted the bell more than an invisible theory about electricity. But gradually, the pattern of tragedy forced change. Records show hundreds of bell ringers killed across Europe by lightning strikes during storms. Parish registers note sudden deaths of young men, struck down at the rope. Some estimates suggest that, in France alone, more than 100 ringers died in the 18th century. The danger became undeniable. In 1786, the French government formally banned storm ringing, recognizing that the practice caused more harm than good. Across Europe, similar prohibitions followed, as lightning rods replaced ropes, and science replaced ritual. Towers that had once thundered with the clash of bronze in every storm grew quiet. The silence was unsettling at first. Villagers, long accustomed to the sound of bells during thunder, felt exposed without it. Some continued the practice secretly, sneaking into towers to toll the bells in defiance of bans. But over time, the habit faded. The lightning rod became a new kind of ritual, a silent, steady guardian on the roof, unseen but trusted. The cultural echoes, however, lingered. Bells retained their sacred role in other parts of life. They still tolled for mass, for funerals, for the marking of hours. In some places, they were even rung gently during storms, not to fight thunder, but as prayers for protection, softer, symbolic echoes of the old belief. Architecture itself bears witness to the shift. Churches of the late 18th and 19th centuries were often fitted with rods and conductors, their spires redesigned with science in mind. Yet many of those same towers still carry inscriptions from earlier centuries. Fulgura frango, I break lightning. The words remain, silent reminders of a time when sound was thought to command the skies. The decline of storm bells is a story of transition, from a world ruled by ritual to one guided by science. Yet it also reveals something enduring about human nature. The wringing was never only about dispersing clouds. It was about reassurance. It was about giving a community the sense that they were not powerless before nature's fury. Even when science replaced the practice, the need for comfort remained. We might ask, did the lightning rod truly end the ritual, or did it simply change its form? The rod, like the bell, became a symbol of safety, a visible marker against chaos. Where once the sound of bronze reassured, now the sight of a metal point rising above the roof carried the same weight. And so, the story of storm bells closes not with a clash, but with a silence. A silence that speaks of change, of lives saved, of old beliefs passing into memory. If you wander through a village in France or Germany today, and see the inscription on an ancient bell, "I scatter thunder," you may smile at the superstition. But to those who once listened in the dark, huddled beneath thunderclouds, the sound was no superstition. It was hope, ringing against the sky. The reflection that lingers is this: when humans toll their bells at the heavens, are they truly trying to change the sky, or are they trying to change themselves, to believe, if only for a moment, that chaos can be ordered by their hands? If you were to wander through a medieval town, past its market stalls and crooked alleys, you would eventually hear it, the steady, rhythmic thud of wet cloth being beaten against stone. It was the sound of laundry, carried out by women whose lives were defined by water, soap, and endless labor. Laundry in the Middle Ages was not a private household chore, done quietly behind walls. It was a public, communal act, often performed at riversides, fountains, or washhouses. In towns across Europe, washerwomen gathered with heavy baskets of soiled linen, scrubbing, wringing, and beating the fabric clean. Their voices mixed with the splashing water, the creak of wooden tubs, and the dull thumps of paddles striking cloth. The work was back-breaking. Clothes were boiled in cauldrons when possible, soaked in lye made from ash, then hauled to the water for rinsing. Linen sheets and wool garments grew heavy with water, demanding the strength of arms and backs to lift, wring, and spread them out to dry. In winter, hands numbed in icy rivers. In summer, the sun scorched and the smell of damp cloth hung in the air. For the women who did it, laundry was both necessity and livelihood. Wealthier households often employed washerwomen, paying them to scrub the endless linens of noble or merchant families. Inns and monasteries, with their constant turnover of beds and habits, relied on teams of laundresses. In many towns, washerwomen formed their own guilds or associations, setting rules for prices and conduct. They became a familiar part of the city's rhythm, moving through streets with baskets balanced on hips, carrying the unspoken burden of cleanliness for others. And yet, despite their importance, laundresses lived on the margins of respectability. The work was considered lowly, associated with dirt, stains, and the intimate garments of others. Medieval literature often cast washerwomen in comic or disreputable roles, linking them unfairly with gossip, bawdiness, or immorality. They were visible everywhere, yet rarely honored. Still, their presence was constant. In Paris, records show public washhouses along the Seine, where laundresses bent for hours over their work. In Florence, laundry stones were set into riverbanks, designed specifically for the beating of cloth. In small villages, women gathered at streams, their chatter and laughter mingling with the slap of fabric. Laundry was also a social act. Women shared news, exchanged stories, and built networks of support while they worked. The riverside was not just a place of labor but of community, a rare space where women's voices could dominate the soundscape of the town. Children played at the edges, splashing in the shallows while their mothers scrubbed and wrung. And yet, their voices are almost silent in the written record. Chronicles note kings and wars, monks and merchants, but rarely the laundress bent over her tub. Their labor sustained daily life, kept households habitable, and maintained the fabric, quite literally, of society, but it left few traces in parchment or stone. To imagine their world is to imagine not grandeur, but monotony, the endless cycle of dirt, soap, and water, the aching muscles at day's end, the pride of returning a basket of linens clean and white. It was a life lived in rhythm with the river, the fountain, the washhouse. And so, a question lingers as the cloth dries on the line. How many lives were built on the unseen, unrecorded labor of women whose work was essential, yet whose stories remain unspoken? Behind the rhythmic thump of cloth on stone lay an entire economy, small but vital, that revolved around the washing of garments. Laundry was not simply a private duty, It was a service, a livelihood, and in many towns, a regulated trade. In large cities like Paris, Florence, and London, washerwomen organized into informal groups or even guild-like associations. They set prices for their services, ensured fair access to public washhouses, and defended their rights against rivals. Records from medieval Paris mention disputes between laundresses and other service workers, often over access to water sources. The Seine, crowded with boats and mills, was also crowded with women bent over their tubs, defending their patch of riverbank as jealously as a merchant defended his stall. Payment was usually by the basket or by weight. Wealthy households, monasteries, and inns relied heavily on these women. Nobles demanded spotless linen, priests needed freshly washed vestments, and taverns constantly cycled through bedding and cloths. To meet the demand, laundresses labored tirelessly, their work often beginning before dawn and continuing until late into the evening. The tools of the trade were humble but essential: wooden tubs, heavy paddles, blocks of soap made from animal fat and ash. Soap itself was costly, and for the poor, ash lye was often the substitute. Laundresses learned to handle both, their hands roughened by caustic mixtures that stung and burned. The smell of soap and wet linen clung to them always. Because their work touched the intimate life of households, laundresses often carried a peculiar social reputation. Handling undergarments, bed linens, and personal items made them both indispensable and, paradoxically, suspect. Medieval satire sometimes portrayed washerwomen as bawdy or gossiping, as if their nearness to the private stains of life tainted their moral standing. In truth, their work was grueling, monotonous, and underpaid, yet society rarely granted them the dignity it deserved. Some laundresses worked independently, moving from house to house, collecting and delivering baskets. Others operated in public facilities, especially in larger cities where authorities built washhouses along rivers. These spaces echoed with voices, laughter, and complaints, turning a necessity into a communal experience. Here, women forged bonds, shared stories, and carved out a corner of independence within the narrow confines of medieval society. Their labor also had a political dimension. Access to water was contested, particularly in dry summers when rivers shrank and fountains slowed. Disputes sometimes broke out between washerwomen and millers, fishermen, or brewers, each claiming priority over the same water. For women who had little voice in courts or councils, defending their right to wash was an act of quiet resistance, a way of asserting presence in the life of the city. Occasionally, their struggles entered official records. In 14th-century Paris, laundresses petitioned the city for fairer access to riverbanks, citing harassment by other workers. In Florence, civic statutes mention the regulation of public washhouses, including hours and fees, to prevent conflict. These glimpses remind us that even in the most ordinary labor, there were negotiations of power and justice. And so, beneath the surface of soap suds and wet cloth, the economy of laundry reveals a world of resilience. It was a trade dominated by women, shaped by necessity, and bound to the flow of rivers and fountains. It was never glamorous, rarely honored, but utterly indispensable. Yet, as we follow the washerwomen through their long days, a question rises with the steam from their tubs. Did their labor truly wash away only stains, or did it also carry the weight of society's dependence, a burden as heavy and unnoticed as the wet linen on their backs? For centuries, the sound of beating cloth by rivers and fountains was as familiar to medieval towns as the toll of bells or the calls of market criers. Washerwomen shaped the rhythm of urban life, their labor invisible in chronicles yet essential in practice. But like so many professions tied to muscle and water, their world slowly faded, leaving only faint traces in the stones of old washhouses and the margins of civic records. The decline began with technology. By the 17th and 18th centuries, new infrastructure reshaped the way water flowed through cities. Aqueducts, pumps, and enclosed conduits redirected streams into controlled fountains and pipes. Public washhouses were expanded in some places, but in others, riverbanks were restricted as industry crowded into the same spaces. Laundresses found themselves competing not only with millers and brewers, but with factories and tanners, whose demands for water carried greater political weight. Industrialization accelerated the change. By the 19th century, the spread of mechanized washing, first large communal facilities, then domestic machines, began to erode the centuries-old trade of hand-washing in rivers. Steam-driven laundries appeared in cities, offering faster, cheaper, and more hygienic services. The old image of women bent over stones gave way to whirring drums and boiling vats. Work did not disappear, but it changed form, shifting from independent washerwomen to wage laborers in industrial laundries. With this shift, voices that had once filled the air at riversides grew quiet. The communal chatter of washerwomen, the gossip and songs that carried across water, were replaced by the mechanical hum of machines. What had once been a trade defined by women's independence, however precarious, became absorbed into the larger machinery of urban industry. And yet, even in decline, the traces of their labor linger. In rural villages across Europe, washhouses built in the 18th and 19th centuries still stand. Known in France as lavoirs, these stone basins with roofs and troughs offered sheltered spaces for laundry long before the advent of modern plumbing. Today, many are preserved as historical curiosities. Stand inside one, and you can almost hear the echo of hands wringing cloth, of paddles striking fabric, of women's voices rising above the splash of water. Their invisibility in written history remains striking. Few names are recorded. Few stories survive. Unlike merchants or guild masters, washerwomen rarely left wills, chronicles, or letters. Their legacy is measured not in parchment but in clean sheets, in garments scrubbed free of stains, in the quiet dignity of survival. Their absence in the record is itself a kind of testimony, a reminder of how much of human history was carried on the shoulders of those who were never written about. The story of medieval laundrywomen is not just about work. It is about the endurance of lives lived in monotony, of strength applied daily without praise, of communities built in the margins of respectability. It is about how survival depended not only on kings or knights, but on women at the river, beating dirt from cloth so that others might live in cleanliness and comfort. As the washhouses fell silent and machines took their place, the world forgot their names. But the fabric of history still bears their imprint, woven into the unnoticed threads of daily life. And so the story closes with this reflection. If the chronicles of history were scrubbed as clean as linen by washerwomen's hands, how many stains of forgetfulness remain, and how much of our past lies hidden in the silent labor of those who left no words behind? Shoes are such ordinary things that we rarely pause to think of them. A pair on your feet today is the product of leather, thread, and craftsmanship, but also of centuries of shifting ideas about status, necessity, and, at times, taxation. For there was a period in European history when shoes themselves, the very coverings that carried people through mud, market, and church, were subject to tax. And in those quiet levees, tucked into the fabric of daily life, simmered small rebellions that spoke volumes about inequality. Taxes on clothing were not new. Medieval and early modern governments often sought revenue from the most visible of commodities: cloth, hats, gloves, even buttons. These were goods that could not be hidden, worn openly on the body, advertising one's means, and thus offering an easy target for officials. Shoes, worn by everyone from nobles to peasants, became an especially tempting candidate. In parts of France and the Low Countries during the late Middle Ages, towns imposed levies on footwear as part of broader market taxes. Shoemakers were required to pay fees for every pair they sold, passing the burden on to customers. In some regions, entire guilds of cobblers found themselves squeezed between civic authorities demanding revenue and customers unwilling or unable to pay higher prices. For the poor, who often owned only one or two pairs of shoes, sometimes patched and mended until they were little more than leather scraps, the tax was not just an inconvenience but a genuine hardship. Shoes were not luxury. They were survival, protection against frozen ground, sharp stones, and filth in streets where refuse and waste were common. To make them dearer was to make life itself harder. The resentment simmered in small, often unrecorded acts. In markets, buyers haggled fiercely, blaming the authorities for inflated prices. In villages, peasants went barefoot longer, stretching the life of worn shoes until they could no longer be patched. In some towns, illegal shoemakers flourished, cobblers who crafted and sold footwear in secret, evading the levies. These quiet resistances rarely sparked riots, but they eroded respect for civic law. Each step barefoot on a cold street was a reminder of distant rulers who taxed necessities. Shoes also carried symbolic weight. To go barefoot was, in many cultures, a mark of poverty, humility, or shame. To be unable to afford taxed shoes was not only uncomfortable but socially visible. A child without shoes, a laborer with cracked soles, a woman walking barefoot to market, these were signs of inequality worn openly in the dust. The shoe tax, then, was not only about money, it was about dignity. Records from certain French towns tell of disputes between shoemakers and magistrates, as cobblers protested the unfair burden of taxes on their trade. In some cases, guilds negotiated exemptions or reduced rates, arguing that shoes were too essential to be treated as luxury. These negotiations rarely made headlines, but they reveal the quiet friction between authority and necessity that shaped medieval economies. And so, in the streets of Europe, each pair of shoes became more than leather and laces. They became silent witnesses to a world where survival was taxed at every step, and where the poorest walked not only under the weight of their burdens, but under the burden of laws that reached even to their feet. The question that lingers is simple, yet profound. When even the shoes on your feet are taxed, how long before every step feels like an act of rebellion? The shoe tax was never only about footwear. It was about the way authority reached into the smallest corners of daily life, and about how ordinary people pushed back, sometimes loudly, more often quietly, in the rhythms of trade and survival. In towns across France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany, cobblers formed strong guilds. These associations were more than trade unions. They were guardians of craft, setting standards for leather quality, dictating apprenticeship rules, and protecting the honor of their profession. When authorities imposed levies on shoes, the guilds found themselves caught in a bind. To comply was to risk angering customers with higher prices. To resist was to invite fines, confiscations, or worse. Some guilds chose negotiation. They petitioned city councils for reduced rates, arguing that shoes were not luxury goods but necessities. Surviving records show guild leaders reminding magistrates that peasants could not walk barefoot to market without shame, that soldiers could not march without boots, that even priests needed shoes to climb the altar steps. Their argument was simple: tax silk, jewels, or spices if you must, but not the leather that kept feet from frost and filth. Others, however, resisted more subtly. In certain towns, cobblers developed practices of underreporting sales, slipping pairs of shoes off the books to avoid paying the levy. Customers sometimes colluded, purchasing footwear in back rooms or during night markets where no official eyes were watching. These were not riots or uprisings, but steady streams of quiet defiance, eroding the reach of taxation one pair at a time. For ordinary people, the tax often translated into worn soles and longer stretches of barefoot life. Children's shoes, quickly outgrown, were a particular burden. Families delayed replacing them, patching holes with scraps of cloth or straw. To see a barefoot child in the marketplace was to see, at once, both poverty and the shadow of the tax. Shoes were no longer just a measure of means, they had become a measure of politics. The symbolism deepened in times of protest. In some regions, going barefoot was adopted deliberately as an act of humility or dissent. Pilgrims walked shoeless to holy shrines, both as penance and as a visible critique of worldly pride. In rare cases, peasants in uprisings appeared barefoot, the absence of shoes serving as both necessity and symbol, proof that the burdens of rule had stripped them of even the most basic protection. Meanwhile, the wealthy flaunted their footwear as a badge of status. Noblemen wore long, pointed shoes known as polaines in France or krakows in England, style so extravagant that they drew ridicule from moralists and regulation from kings. To wear such shoes was to declare freedom from both poverty and petty levies. For them, taxes were absorbed easily. For the poor, every stitch of leather was counted. This divide sharpened resentment. To pay dearly for patched shoes while nobles strutted in extravagance was to feel the injustice of society at every step. Taxes on necessities revealed, in ways no decree or sermon could, the unequal distribution of burden. Even so, the shoe tax persisted in many regions, not because it was loved, but because it was simple. Like the window tax, it was visible and easy to enforce. Shoes could be counted. Cobblers could be monitored. Unlike hidden wealth, footwear was worn openly on the body. And so the quiet rebellions continued, in underreported sales, in patched soles, in the silence of children walking barefoot through muddy streets. The guilds negotiated, the poor endured, and the tax collectors counted, each step echoing the strange truth that in medieval Europe, even the ground beneath one's feet was not free of levy. The question remains: when the cost of walking is set not by the road but by the rulers, does every journey become a reminder of who truly owns your path? Like many small but burdensome levies, the shoe tax did not last forever. It lingered for decades, sometimes centuries in local variations, but eventually faded as rulers sought other, more profitable sources of revenue. Yet its legacy endured, not in monuments or chronicles, but in the quiet habits of resistance and in the symbolism that clung to shoes long after the tax itself had vanished. The decline came partly through practicality. Taxes that burdened necessities often produced resentment greater than the revenue they raised. By the 17th and 18th centuries, governments increasingly turned toward customs duties, trade tariffs, and more structured forms of property taxation. Shoes, humble and essential, no longer seemed worth the trouble of counting. Local authorities began to repeal or ignore the levies, sometimes replacing them with guild fees or market tolls that were less visible to the poor. But the memory of those taxes lingered, preserved in proverbs, stories, and subtle traditions. In some towns, old cobbler guild records mention the days of foot taxes, recalling disputes with magistrates and petitions for relief. In villages, stories were told of ancestors who went barefoot longer than they should have, waiting until harvest profits could cover not only leather but levy. Such memories became part of the fabric of resentment toward distant rulers, one thread among many that wove into later movements for reform. Shoes themselves grew in symbolic weight. By the 18th century, bare feet were a common emblem of poverty and oppression. In paintings and literature, a barefoot peasant was not simply a man without shoes. He was an image of suffering under unjust burdens. In some revolutionary imagery, to walk shoeless was to show solidarity with the oppressed. The shadow of earlier taxes colored these symbols, even when the levies themselves had long been repealed. Meanwhile, among the wealthy, shoes remained markers of privilege and display. The extravagance of noble footwear, buckles, embroidery, silk, stood in contrast to the patched soles of the poor. To the reformers and satirists of the 18th century, this contrast was an easy target. The shoe became a shorthand for inequality, a reminder that even the ground one walked on was divided by class. The legacy of resistance also endured in subtler ways. The evasions of cobblers, the quiet collusion of customers, the guild petitions, all of these trained people in the arts of negotiation and quiet defiance. The habits of mistrusting tax collectors, of bending rules at the edges of necessity, carried forward into later centuries, shaping the ways ordinary people dealt with authority. Today, the shoe tax is a footnote in history, remembered only in scattered records and the occasional mention in guild archives. But its memory lingers every time shoes are used as symbols in protest. To lay down shoes in a square, to march barefoot in demonstration, to speak of walking in another's shoes. These echoes carry faint traces of a time when even footwear was counted, taxed, and resisted. And so, the story of the shoe tax closes with one last reflection. When rulers once taxed the very soles that touched the earth, what does it tell us about power? That even the simplest step could become a reminder of who controlled the path beneath your feet. Before electricity, before gas lamps, before even oil lamps were common in Northern Europe, there was the candle. A small flame, flickering in the dark, illuminating a table or chapel. It was a fragile defense against the long nights of the Middle Ages. And behind that small light stood an entire trade, the candlemakers, whose lives were steeped in the smells of wax and tallow, their hands perpetually sticky with grease and soot. To imagine medieval life is to imagine darkness. In winter, night fell early and lingered long. Houses had few windows, streets were unlit, and travel after sundown was dangerous. A candle was not luxury but necessity, used for prayer, work, and the simple comfort of pushing back the dark. Yet candles did not appear by magic. They were crafted, carefully and laboriously, by men and women whose trade combined chemistry, labor, and patience. There were two main kinds of candles in the medieval world, tallow and wax. Tallow candles were made from animal fat, usually the rendered remains of cattle or sheep. They were cheap, accessible, and smoky. Their smell was pungent, a mix of grease and ash, and in closed rooms, they could make eyes sting. Wax candles, by contrast, were made from beeswax. They burned cleanly, gave off a sweet aroma, and produced a steady, bright flame. But they were costly, reserved for the wealthy, for churches, and for great ceremonies. The candlemaker's shop reflected this divide. In one corner, vats of melted tallow simmered, the air thick with its heavy scent. Workers dipped wicks repeatedly, layer by layer, until a usable candle formed. In another corner, beeswax was purified, strained, and shaped into finer candles for altars and noble halls. The contrast was stark, tallow for the masses, wax for the elite. The process was repetitive and exhausting. Wicks were cut, dipped, cooled, and dipped again, sometimes dozens of times. Each candle had to be shaped evenly, trimmed, and set aside to harden. In larger workshops, rows of candles hung drying, their pale forms swaying slightly in the draft. The air was never clean. Smoke from vats, the stench of fat, the tang of molten wax. Candle makers carried the smell on their clothes and skin, marked by their trade in ways no water could fully wash away. Candles were sold in markets by the dozen, bundled with cords. Families bought them sparingly, lighting them only when necessary, stretching each stub of wick as far as it could go. For churches, orders were massive. Cathedrals consumed thousands of wax candles a year, their flames flickering before altars, statues, and shrines. Monasteries, with their long hours of prayer, required steady supplies. Candle makers who secured church contracts prospered, while others scraped by selling tallow sticks to peasants. The trade was often regulated. In many towns, candle makers formed guilds, setting rules for quality and price. Fraudulent candles, too thin, too smoky, or mixed with inferior fats, could bring fines. Guilds also defended the privileges of wax chandlers, who guarded their monopoly on the precious material. The division between wax and tallow makers was not just about product but about status, with wax chandlers enjoying higher esteem. And yet, for all their labor, candle makers rarely earned wealth or honor. Their trade was necessary but humble, their lives spent in perpetual grease and smoke. They lived close to fire, their shops filled with flammable material, accidents always a threat. Still, their work gave light to towns and churches, their hands feeding the flames that carried prayers upward and guided families through the dark. Picture a medieval evening, a family gathered around a single tallow candle, its wavering light throwing shadows on the walls. Or a cathedral glowing with hundreds of wax flames, golden light dancing on stone and glass. Each flame came from the labor of candle makers, anonymous artisans whose work burned away quietly in the service of others. And so, a question flickers in the dark. When a candle burns, is it only the wick and wax consumed, or also the unseen labor of those who made it, their lives melting away one dip at a time? In the Middle Ages, light was not free. Every flicker came with a cost, measured in wax, tallow, or oil, and behind each flame stood an economy that sustained both households and cathedrals. Candle makers, though rarely celebrated, sat at the heart of this economy, their trade balancing necessity, ritual, and commerce. The demand for candles was immense. In monasteries, prayers were said at fixed hours throughout the night, requiring steady light for reading psalms and scriptures. In parish churches, candles burned before altars, shrines, and images of saints. The faithful were encouraged to donate candles as offerings, their flames symbolizing prayers rising to heaven. In towns, guilds sponsored candles for processions, festivals, and funerals. Each act of devotion fed the demand for wax. Wax was the most prized form of light. Clean, bright, and sweet-smelling, it was considered worthy of sacred spaces. The wax chandlers' guilds guarded their trade fiercely, ensuring only the purest wax was sold to churches and the wealthy. Some guilds even dictated the proportions of wax to be used, forbidding mixtures with cheaper fats. Fraud was punished harshly, for a smoky candle in a cathedral was not just an inconvenience but a sacrilege. Tallow, meanwhile, remained the light of the common household. Rendered from animal fat, it was cheaper but foul-smelling, producing thick smoke and greasy soot. Poorer families lit tallow candles sparingly, often saving them for essential tasks. Many relied on rushlights, reeds dipped in fat, a dim, sputtering flame that barely pierced the dark. For them, light was not comfort but calculation. How much grease could be spared? How long could a wick burn? The candle trade was tied to other industries. Butchers supplied the fat for tallow. Beekeepers provided the wax. Markets for these raw materials fluctuated with seasons and harvests. In years when bee colonies thrived, wax was plentiful and affordable. In years of poor yield, prices soared, and only the richest churches could afford their usual quantities. Candle makers thus lived in rhythm with animals and seasons, their prosperity bound to forces beyond their control. Guild rivalries also shaped the trade. In many towns, wax chandlers and tallow chandlers were distinct professions, with separate rights and privileges. Wax chandlers often enjoyed higher status, their work tied to the church and the wealthy. Tallow chandlers, associated with the smoky light of the poor, were looked down upon, their shops marked by the ever-present stench of rendered fat. Yet both were needed, for society demanded light at every level. Candles also became part of social rituals. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, all required candles, their flames marking transitions of life. In processions, guilds carried massive wax torches, symbols of wealth and devotion. Nobles displayed their prosperity by illuminating banquets with wax, while peasants scraped together coins for tallow at feast days. To give light was to give honor, to show devotion, to mark one's place in society. For the candlemaker, these customs meant steady work, but not always steady income. The trade was precarious, vulnerable to fluctuations in supply and demand. Some makers prospered through contracts with churches or guilds, while others lived on the edge of poverty, their days spent dipping wicks without ever seeing more than a handful of coins. Their labor melted away each evening, consumed in the flames of others' prayers and celebrations. And yet, the presence of candles shaped daily rhythms. Streets fell into darkness after sundown, but within homes, a single stub of tallow extended the day. In monasteries, the glow of wax sustained hours of prayer. In cathedrals, rows of candles transformed stone into a glowing vision of heaven. All of it depended on the humble trade of candlemakers, who turned fat and wax into fleeting light. So the economy of light was not merely material. It was symbolic, spiritual, and social. To buy a candle was to buy time, devotion, and dignity. To sell one was to trade in moments of hope and necessity. And yet the question lingers like smoke in the rafters. Was it the flame itself that mattered, or the unseen hands that made it possible? Hands that labored in darkness so that others might live in light. For centuries, the candle was humanity's faithful companion in darkness. It lit the prayers of monks, the feasts of nobles, and the humble tables of peasants. It was both sacred and ordinary, fragile yet indispensable. And at the center of it all stood the candlemakers, men and women whose trade was simple yet vital, whose lives were steeped in grease, wax, and fire. But no trade lasts forever. The decline of candlemaking as a central industry came gradually, shaped first by small innovations, then by the sweeping tides of modernity. The first challenge came from oil. In coastal towns and cities with access to trade, whale oil and other lamp oils began to supplement tallow. Oil lamps burned longer and cleaner than fat candles, and though they did not replace them entirely, they offered an alternative. For the poor, rushlights and tallow continued. For the wealthy, lamps joined wax candles on banquet tables and in chapels. The greater change came with the 18th and 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution transformed every corner of daily life, and light was no exception. New methods of processing fats led to the invention of stearin candles, harder, cleaner, and more affordable than tallow. Paraffin, distilled from petroleum in the 19th century, produced candles that were inexpensive and burned with a steady, white light. The humble trades of medieval tallow chandlers and wax chandlers were swept into larger industries, their small workshops replaced by factories. Even more transformative was gaslight, and later electricity. In the great cities of Europe, gas lamps began to line streets in the late 18th century, pushing back darkness on a scale candles could never achieve. By the late 19th century, electricity spread, and with it, a new age of light. Candles, once essential, became symbolic, reserved for rituals, ceremonies, or moments of intimacy. The candle makers of the Middle Ages could not have imagined such a future. Their entire lives were bound to the belief that darkness was the natural state, and that every flicker had to be earned with labor. For them, light was costly, fragile, and precious. To us, it is cheap, constant, and abundant. And so their trade faded into memory. Guilds dissolved, shops closed, and the smell of melted tallow no longer filled the alleys of towns. Only in churches did candles retain their central role, still burning before altars, still symbolizing prayers rising to heaven. In homes, they became tokens of romance or tradition, no longer necessities but luxuries of mood. Yet the legacy of candlemakers endures in ways easy to overlook. Every candle lit today, whether in a cathedral or on a birthday cake, carries echoes of their labor. The dip of the wick, the layering of wax, the patience of hands repeating the same motions for hours, all are hidden within that small flame. Their world may have vanished, but their craft remains embedded in our rituals of light. The story of the medieval candlemaker is thus not one of triumph or wealth, but of endurance. It is the story of ordinary artisans whose work sustained the rhythms of life for centuries, only to vanish quietly when new light arrived. History rarely remembers such trades, yet without them, the great cathedrals would have stood in darkness, and the simplest evenings would have been swallowed by night. And so, the final reflection flickers as softly as a dying flame. When we light a candle today, do we see only the glow, or do we also glimpse the shadows of those forgotten lives, consumed in the quiet work of giving others light? In our world, you wake to the buzz of an alarm clock, the vibration of a phone, or the soft chime of a digital device. But before springs, bells, and electricity entered bedrooms, the problem of waking on time was no small matter. In fact, it was important enough to create an entire profession, the knocker-upper, the human alarm clock. The story belongs mostly to the early modern period, stretching from the 17th into the 19th centuries, but its roots are medieval. For as long as people lived by the rhythms of bells and daylight, the question remained: how do you rise at the right hour, especially when work demanded precision? Monks had their own solution: the strict tolling of monastery bells at night and dawn, rung by novices who stumbled through cloisters with lanterns. In towns, church bells too marked the hours. But these public signals were general, not personal. A baker who needed to rise at 3 in the morning to heat his oven could not rely on the parish bell that tolled only at 6. And so, by the 17th century in England and parts of Northern Europe, the profession of the knocker-upper began to appear. These were men and women whose sole task was to wake others at appointed times. Their tools were simple but effective: long sticks, sometimes with a knob of wood or metal at the end, used to tap on upper-story windows. Some used pea shooters or small tubes to spit dried peas against the glass, the tiny rattle loud enough to stir a sleeper but unlikely to break the pane. The sight must have been strange to us, yet ordinary to them. In the still darkness before dawn, a figure pacing the cobblestones, glancing up at houses, and rapping steadily at shutters until movement stirred inside. The knocker-upper then moved on to the next client, keeping a careful mental map of who had paid for what time. In industrial towns, where mill workers needed to rise before sunrise, dozens of people relied on a single knocker-upper making his rounds. The profession thrived especially in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. Factories demanded punctuality, and tardiness meant lost wages or dismissal. Alarm clocks existed, but they were expensive and unreliable for ordinary workers. The knocker-upper filled the gap. For a small fee each week, they guaranteed a timely awakening. It was a service born of necessity, woven into the life of working-class neighborhoods. Payment was modest, a penny or two per week, but steady. Knocker-uppers developed routes, waking clients in sequence. Some were retired men supplementing pensions. Others were women who combined the work with household duties. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, entire communities depended on them. The tap on the window was as much a part of the dawn as the crow of a rooster had been in rural life. And yet, despite their importance, knocker-uppers lived in a curious social space. They were essential, but invisible. Their work happened at hours when most slept. Their voices, calling softly to confirm a job done, disappeared into the dawn air. Few chroniclers bothered to record their names. Like the washerwomen at riversides or the candlemakers in their smoky shops, they belonged to the world of forgotten trades, ordinary lives sustaining extraordinary changes. Picture an English street in 1830, narrow brick houses, factory smoke hanging heavy, and in the pale gray before sunrise, the tap-tap-tap of a stick on glass. Inside, a tired worker groans, pulls on boots, and heads for the mill. Outside, the knocker-upper lifts his stick, marks another job done, and walks on. The city wakes, one tap at a time. And so, the first question rises with the morning. When an entire community depends on one person's knock to wake, who truly holds the power over the rhythm of life, the factory bell, or the human alarm in the street? The profession of the knocker-upper may seem quaint, even comic to us today, but to those who relied on it, it was deadly serious. To miss the hour meant lost wages, discipline from overseers, or even dismissal. Factories and mills did not wait for latecomers, and the knocker-upper became a kind of guardian of punctuality. Their success depended on precision, discretion, and a few clever tricks of the trade. The tools of their craft varied. The most common was the long pole or stick, sometimes extending up to 10 feet, allowing the knocker-upper to reach second- and third-story windows. At the end might be a knob, a ball of cloth, or even a short wire hook to rap against glass without breaking it. Some developed lighter methods. Pea shooters were especially popular, delivering a staccato rattle that stirred sleepers without disturbing the whole street. A well-aimed pea against a pane could mimic the urgent tap of knuckles. Others carried small batons or canes, using them to tap at lower windows or doors. The trick was to wake only the paying client, not the entire household or neighborhood. Too loud a knock invited anger from those who had not paid. Too soft, and the sleeper might remain lost in dreams. The skill lay in striking just enough to rouse, then moving on before irritation boiled over. Knocker-uppers often worked with remarkable memory. They carried no watches, relying instead on the rhythm of bells, the crow of roosters, or the position of the stars to keep time. Experienced ones knew their routes so well they could tell the hour by the sequence of houses they visited. Some carried lanterns, their glow bobbing along narrow alleys, guiding them from window to window like wandering constellations of the waking world. The culture of the trade was practical, but it carried its own quiet codes. Regular clients often built trust with their knocker-uppers, paying in advance for weeks or months of service. Entire families depended on a single figure's punctuality. A missed knock could mean disaster, and word spread quickly if a knocker-upper failed. Reliability was everything. Some became minor local celebrities. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, where the trade was most entrenched, townspeople knew their knocker-uppers by name. They were fixtures of the dawn, as recognizable as the lamplighter in the evening. Newspapers occasionally mentioned them in anecdotes, half amused, half admiring of their peculiar occupation. And yet, the job was hard. It demanded rising before the earliest clients, often in freezing cold or driving rain. Knocker-uppers paced dark streets while the rest of the world slept, their own rest constantly cut short. For a penny or two a week per client, they carried the responsibility of entire workforces. Few grew rich from it. Most scraped by, combining the work with other trades, chimney sweeping, odd jobs, or factory work later in the day. Still, there was pride in the precision. Knocker-uppers knew they were vital to the rhythm of industrial towns. The hum of looms, the clatter of spinning machines, the roar of furnaces, all of it depended, indirectly, on their punctual taps. They were the invisible link between slumbering households and the relentless march of the factory clock. And so the knock on the glass became more than just a sound. It was a signal that the day was beginning, that survival demanded another round of labor, that time itself was money. The knocker-upper, in their quiet way, held a thread of power, the ability to pull entire streets from dreams into the gray dawn of work. Which leaves us to wonder, was the knocker-upper merely a servant of the clock? Or, for those few minutes before dawn, did they hold mastery over time itself? Like many professions born of necessity, the knocker-upper's trade did not last forever. Its rise was tied to the strict demands of the early modern city and the factory town, and its decline was tied just as surely to technology. What was once essential gradually became obsolete, until the last knock echoed faintly into memory. The first challenge came from the spread of affordable alarm clocks in the 19th century. Clockmaking had long been an art reserved for the wealthy, with timepieces as costly as jewels. But the Industrial Revolution, which had created the need for knocker-uppers in the first place, also produced cheaper, mass-manufactured clocks. By the mid-1800s, working-class families could sometimes afford small bedside alarms. They were imperfect, prone to breakdowns, difficult to set precisely, but they freed households from dependence on a human tap at the window. For a while, knocker-uppers coexisted with the machines. Many workers still trusted the certainty of a human knock over the uncertain ring of gears and bells. Some used both, the clock as a backup, the knocker as insurance. But as prices dropped and reliability improved, the balance shifted. By the late 19th century, newspapers began to remark on the profession as an oddity, a quaint survival in industrial towns. Some writers described knocker-uppers with gentle humor, marveling at their persistence in an age of mechanical timekeeping. Others treated them as curiosities, relics destined to vanish with the spread of modernity. Still, in places like Lancashire and Yorkshire, the tradition endured well into the 20th century. Oral histories recall elderly women and men, long poles in hand, making rounds even in the 1920s and 30s. In some communities, loyalty to the knocker-upper lasted longer than logic demanded, their familiar presence woven into the rhythm of life. It was not only about being woken. It was about trust, routine, and the comfort of hearing that tap before dawn. Eventually, though, the profession disappeared. Electric clocks and, later, radios and telephones rendered the knocker-upper redundant. By the mid-20th century, only a handful remained, remembered more as folklore than as necessity. Photographs survive of the last practitioners, wiry figures in caps and coats, holding impossibly long sticks, captured just before their trade vanished forever. What lingers is the memory of their role. They remind us of a world before mechanical certainty, when human beings themselves became instruments of time. They reveal how survival in the industrial age depended not only on machines and factories, but on people who filled the gaps between invention and affordability. They show us that even in the age of progress, trust was placed not in gears but in neighbors with poles and pea shooters. And so, the knocker-upper remains a symbol of resilience, of adaptation, of the strange ways communities organize themselves around necessity. Their legacy is not in monuments but in anecdotes, in the faint echo of a tap on glass heard in old stories of northern towns. The story ends with a reflection as soft as the dawn light. When machines replaced the knocker-upper, did we truly gain freedom,